Hello everyone, and welcome to the channel. The Middle East war is not just about missiles and maps. It is about the petrodollar system, shipping insurance, and whether the United States can still police the economic order that made the dollar dominant in the first place. And if that system cracks, this does not stay in Tehran or Tel Aviv. It lands in Europe, in energy bills, freight costs, industrial pressure, and in small states like Lithuania that always discover geopolitics through invoices first. That is the contradiction I want to start with. Washington still talks like the manager of the global system, but the costs of running that system are rising. The US share of world output is much lower than it was when Bretton Woods was created, and the mechanisms that kept the dollar on top are now under pressure from war, debt, and logistics. Under Bretton Woods, the United States accounted for more than half of world output. Today, depending on the method, it is closer to the mid-teens in purchasing power terms, and roughly a quarter in nominal terms. The scale changed, the burden did not. So the real question is not whether the old slogans still sound impressive. The question is whether the underlying machine still works. And this is where I want to be careful. There is a lot of commentary right now, some of it useful, some of it theatrical, and some of it dressed up as revelation, when it is really just emotion with a microphone. My job here is to separate what is publicly visible, what is plausible, and what actually matters for Europe. Start with the basic timeline. The conflict around Iran has widened the risk profile across the Gulf. The market reaction tells you why that matters. Roughly 1/5 of globally traded oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz. About 1/5 of global LNG trade is exposed to the same corridor. If that route becomes dangerous, the effect is immediate. Shipping risk rises, insurance is repriced, cargoes are delayed, and energy prices move before politicians finish their statements. Let me translate bureaucratic language into plain reality. A supply disruption is not just fewer barrels or fewer cargoes. It is also delayed cargoes, repriced insurance, stranded ships, frozen decisions, and a market that starts charging panic premiums long before physical shortages become visible in full. If the route becomes dangerous, the cost of moving energy rises. If the cost rises, somebody pays. And in Europe, that somebody is usually households, SMEs, and energy-intensive industry. Now, take the second layer. Why does this connect to the dollar at all? Because the post-1970s dollar order was never just about having a strong currency. It was about a system in which key commodities, especially oil, were priced, settled, financed, and recycled through a US-centered architecture. That architecture needed three things. First, trust in the dollar as the main reserve and settlement currency. Second, logistics that allowed energy and goods to move under predictable rules. Third, security guarantees that made producers and buyers believe the route was protected and the framework stable. If any of those three starts to crack, the system becomes more expensive to maintain. If two crack at once, the system becomes politically contested. And if all three crack together, then you do not get an orderly policy adjustment. You get fragmentation. That is the first mechanism chain in this story. War expands in the Gulf. Shipping risk rises. Insurance and freight spike. Energy prices rise. Importers pay more. Inflation pressure returns. Governments either subsidize or force households and industry to absorb the shock. That hits fiscal balances and political legitimacy. And at the top of the system, the reserve currency state is expected to stabilize all of this, while already running giant debt and defense obligations. A to B to C to consequence. No magic step in the middle. The core point here is simple. The United States can no longer maintain a global monetary security architecture at the same relative cost it once could, because the relative weight of the American economy has declined, while the number of obligations has multiplied. That does not mean the dollar disappears tomorrow. It means the cost-benefit logic of the empire deteriorates. And when empires face deteriorating cost-benefit logic, they usually do one of three things: retrench, overreact, or pretend the old model still works until events humiliate them. Trump matters here, not because he invented the problem, but because he gave political language to part of it. The ideal version of his project would have been straightforward: rebuild U.S. industrial strength, reduce the subsidy to the old global order, and keep enough military leverage to manage retreat without admitting retreat. Whether he has a fully coherent plan is a different question. I am not convinced he does, but the direction is visible. A more selective empire, less custodian of the world, more collector of tolls. And yet here is the contradiction again. Even if Washington wants to reduce the burden of empire, it cannot simply walk away without weakening the structures that kept the dollar central. The more it tries to enforce order through force, the more it raises the costs. The more it retreats, the more others test the structure. So it oscillates between overextension and selective withdrawal. That is why you get these strange political moments, where one day the rhetoric sounds absolute, and the next day the messaging sounds like an exit script. There is a line most people skip. Global monetary dominance was always partly an energy security story and partly a logistics story. It was never just central banks and financial derivatives. If energy and goods cannot move under insurable, predictable conditions, then even a strong currency loses part of its operating environment. Now bring in the Gulf monarchies. One of the most useful points in the source material is not the most dramatic one. It is the one about money flows. The old arrangement assumed not only that oil would be sold in dollars, but also that surplus capital from the region would keep flowing back into U.S. assets and the wider dollar ecosystem. If Gulf states now begin to doubt whether U.S. security guarantees are worth the political and physical risk, then their allocation logic changes. Not instantly, not romantically, but gradually and materially. They hedge, they diversify, they reduce exposure. They spread sovereign money across regions, currencies, assets, and political relationships. That does not abolish the dollar overnight. It weakens the automatic recycling mechanism that helped support it. So what does that mean in practice? It means the Gulf is no longer just a passive reservoir of petrodollar obedience. It is a zone of strategic hedging, and hedging is the opposite of imperial stability. Now I want to address the Israeli layer, because it matters and because too many people discuss it either as devotional theology or as pure propaganda. The more sober reading is this: Israeli state strategy increasingly looks reckless in regional terms because it assumes escalation can still be controlled by superior force and by permanent U.S. backing. That assumption may already be outdated. You do not need to be anti-Israel to see that. You just need a functioning sense of strategic overreach. If a state expands military confrontation faster than its sponsor can stabilize the broader theater, then it creates a trap for both itself and its sponsor. That is where we are. The harder line inside Israel may be politically understandable inside its own security doctrine, but from the wider regional and economic perspective, it begins to look like a force multiplier for systemic instability. To put it less politely, they are behaving like a state that became too used to exemption from consequences. Small states in Europe should pay attention here, because this is what happens when political classes start believing military escalation is cleaner than diplomatic compromise. The bill always arrives, usually in energy and inflation first, and in security later. Now, another point from the source is worth reframing. The war has already begun to damage the global logistics system. That sounds dramatic, but the underlying point is correct. Once logistics becomes uncertain, the world fragments by cost. Some routes stay open but become expensive. Some routes stay open only for some buyers. Some routes remain theoretically open but commercially unusable because insurers, owners, or charterers step back. This is how deglobalization actually feels in the real economy. Not as a big speech, as missing cargoes, longer routes, higher insurance, more inventory stress, and then slower growth. And here the European lens becomes unavoidable. Europe entered this decade already weakened by a self-inflicted energy shock, an industrial competitiveness problem, and a belief that it could run rearmament, decarbonization, welfare protection, and geopolitical virtue signaling all at once. That was always fantasy dressed as policy. Energy-intensive industry was already under pressure. Import dependence had not disappeared. Budget room was not infinite. Now a Gulf War pushes oil higher, gas prices higher, shipping risk higher, and strategic dependence back into the spotlight. Brent can move fast in this kind of environment. TTF gas can spike far above what politicians are comfortable admitting. And once that happens, every talk show suddenly rediscovers ordinary people. This is the second mechanism chain. Gulf conflict raises shipping and energy costs. Europe imports the shock. Higher energy costs hit chemicals, metals, transport, food processing, and everything with a thin margin. Governments try to soften the blow. Fiscal pressure rises. Voters see higher bills and weaker growth. Political polarization deepens. In countries like Germany, France, Italy, and across the Baltics, the question becomes painfully simple. Who is paying for strategic choices made above their salary bracket? And no, the answer is not the enemy. The answer is ordinary consumers and productive businesses pay first. Financial traders may even enjoy the volatility. Bureaucracies survive. The state can shift costs across years through borrowing. But the factory deciding whether to keep a line open, or the Lithuanian household deciding whether this winter feels normal or not, does not have those luxuries. Let me put it more bluntly. The European story right now is not green transition versus fossil nostalgia. It is physics and affordability versus a political class that still thinks messaging can outrun cost. If energy stays structurally expensive and security risk stays structurally high, then Europe's model of moral posturing plus imported energy plus industrial self-harm becomes much harder to defend. This is why the Lithuania first lens matters. Small European states do not control the architecture. They live inside it. We do not decide Gulf shipping risk. We inherit it. We do not decide the reserve currency structure. We feel its cracks through imported inflation, tighter budgets, and slower growth. And because we are small, we feel changes in financing and energy costs faster. Bigger states can pretend longer. Small states adjust sooner, or they suffer more visibly. It means that a Middle East war can function like an accelerated stress test on the dollar order without requiring a dramatic dollar collapse headline. The system can weaken through cost, fragmentation, and reduced trust long before it breaks through spectacle. Now, the source text also spends a lot of time on water, desalination, and the fragility of Gulf urban models. I am not going to repeat every dramatic projection, because some of it goes beyond what we can responsibly state as public fact. But the strategic principle is sound. Modern states depend not just on oil and money, but on infrastructure chains that are easy to overlook until they are at risk. Water, electricity, logistics, and food are not side issues. They are security assets. And in the Gulf, desalination and imported logistics matter enormously. If conflict puts those systems at risk, then the political stability premium of the region shrinks. The same logic applies elsewhere. In a fragmented world, security becomes the premium asset. That line from the source is actually one of the strongest. Security becomes the premium. I would phrase it this way. In the next phase of the world economy, security is the thing that determines how expensive everything else becomes. Safer routes, safer jurisdictions, safer supply chains, safer energy, safer water, safer data systems. Those are premium conditions now, and premium conditions raise costs. This is why business owners should care even if they are not in oil, shipping, or macro finance. If the world fragments into bigger blocks with more contested borders, then logistics, insurance, compliance, financing, and inventory all become more expensive. That means the normal business model of the last 2 decades, built on cheap transport, cheap security, and cheap assumptions, starts to die. Some people still think they can sit one more year in the old comfort zone. They cannot. The comfort zone has already been sold off and invoiced. Now let's talk scenarios. Scenario 1 is the orderly outcome. The Gulf conflict stabilizes before the worst choke points become fully unusable. The United States claims limited success and reduces exposure. Oil and gas prices remain elevated but manageable. Gulf capital continues diversifying quietly rather than panicking. Europe suffers another energy shock, but adapts with subsidies, slower growth, and more painful industrial triage. The dollar does not collapse. It simply becomes less unchallenged, more expensive to maintain, and more openly political. This is the least dramatic outcome and still unpleasant. Scenario 2 is the chaotic outcome. Shipping through Hormuz remains impaired for longer. Insurance, routing, and freight keep jumping. LNG supply gets disrupted more severely. Oil stays high. Europe imports inflation and stagnation together. Gulf states accelerate hedging, and more trade begins moving outside the neat old US-centered recycling loop. The US burns through more money and munitions while claiming success in public. In this version, the dollar is not replaced quickly, but confidence in the wider US-run architecture deteriorates much faster. Scenario 3 is the technocratic outcome. The conflict becomes the excuse for a new round of centralization. More defense spending, more strategic industrial policy, more infrastructure controls, more capital discipline, more digital monitoring, more exception management in the name of resilience. The dollar order does not die. It mutates. Europe does not become sovereign. It becomes more managed. The US does not restore the old empire. It runs a more selective and expensive one, and ordinary people are told this is responsibility. Which of these is most likely? At this moment, the world is oscillating between the orderly and technocratic outcomes, with the chaotic outcome always one bad decision away. That is not drama. That is structure. Let me translate another piece of bureaucratic language into plain reality. When officials say resilience, they usually mean you will pay more for a less efficient system, and be told that this is maturity. Sometimes they are right. Security is not free. But the question is always, who pays, who decides, and who still gets rich while everyone else is asked to sacrifice? This is where the who pays, who wins frame matters. Who wins if the old order frays slowly rather than collapsing fast? Large commodity exporters with room to maneuver. Defense firms, shipping and insurance players able to price risk. States with domestic energy, industrial depth, and strategic ambiguity. Financial actors who profit from volatility. Who pays? European households, SMEs, energy-intensive industry, import-dependent small states, workers whose wages do not rise as fast as strategic costs, and businesses that still rely on the fiction that logistics is just a background service. Who loses politically? Any elite that built legitimacy on stability and cheapness while actively undermining both. Now I want to return once more to the Israel point, because it belongs in the analysis. The sharper, cleaner line is this. Israeli leadership increasingly behaves as if escalation itself is strategy. That can produce tactical shock. It does not produce durable regional order. And when a state becomes convinced that every escalation can be managed because its sponsor will always cover the tail risk, it usually discovers the opposite at the worst possible moment. That is not a moral sermon. It is a historical pattern. The same logic applies to Europe. For years, Europe outsourced hard power upward and pushed costs downward. It outsourced strategic discipline to Washington and imported energy while preaching transition. Now it is discovering that dependence is not abstract. Dependence is the point where a war somewhere else begins editing your budget at home. Around here in Lithuania, that matters immediately. Fuel matters, transport matters, heating matters, industrial competitiveness matters. If the broader European system takes another energy hit, while also financing more defense and living through slower growth, then the Baltics will not be spared by virtue. We will feel it through prices, capital costs, and labor decisions. This is what being a corridor looks like. You are not the empire. You are not the superpower. You are the space through which cost and pressure move. If this is useful, subscribe and tell me what you're seeing in your country. Now I want to address the dollar collapse slogan directly, because it is emotionally satisfying and analytically lazy. Reserve currency systems do not usually collapse like a bridge in one dramatic second. They lose coherence. They become more coercive, more expensive, less universal, and more openly political. People build workarounds. Trade gets rerouted. Assets get diversified. Clients become hedgers. Rivals become selective partners. The center still dominates, but the cost of dominance rises. That is how imperial decay usually looks in real time, not as a clean headline, but as growing friction. So when people say the empire of the dollar is in decline, the useful version of that claim is not the dollar dies next quarter. The useful version is the architecture that made dollar dominance cheap and effortless is breaking down. The US can keep the currency powerful while losing the ease with which the system once reproduced itself. That is more subtle and more dangerous because it pushes Washington toward selective force, selective retreat, and louder ideological packaging. And yes, ideology is all over this. States wrap economic stress in civilizational language because sacrifice sells better with holy music. But underneath the rhetoric, the drivers are budgets, munitions, infrastructure, logistics, and the old question every empire eventually faces. Is the perimeter still worth the cost? This is where the extra numbers matter. U.S. federal debt is already above $36 trillion. Interest payments alone are now around or above $1 trillion annually, depending on the measure. So even before you add another major geopolitical burden, the financial structure is already heavy. That does not mean bankruptcy tomorrow. It means less room for mistakes. And according to public reporting, the Pentagon is already searching for money for Iran-linked operations and for replenishing munitions. That is not what a frictionless hegemon looks like. That is what a system under strain looks like. And when the center is strained, the periphery recalculates. Gulf monarchies recalculate. Europe recalculates. Asia recalculates. Markets recalibrate faster than diplomats. So what does that mean in practice? Even if the war cools down tomorrow, the repricing of risk has already started. The old cheap assumptions are gone. Now, some of the most extreme claims in the source text about exact elite conspiracies and total civilizational collapse in specific regions, I am not going to present as established fact. Public evidence does not justify that level of certainty, but I will say this: the broad direction toward fragmentation, higher strategic cost, and regional bloc formation is entirely plausible and increasingly visible. That matters because a weaker global growth environment makes all adjustment harder. You can manage geopolitical stress more easily when growth is strong, energy is cheap, and trade is expanding. You manage it badly when energy is volatile, defense spending is rising, public finances are stretched, and productivity is weak. Europe is in that second world. So is much of the US allied system. And that is why I keep returning to the same line. The old world is ending faster than the new world is being designed. That gap is the danger. For entrepreneurs, the message is not panic. Panic is for amateurs in television. The message is stop assuming that the last 15 years are the baseline. Recheck exposure to energy, shipping, insurance, payments, and geography. Recheck which markets depend on political stability that may no longer exist. Recheck where your inputs come from and which routes they need. Recheck the difference between a cheap supplier and a resilient supplier. Those are no longer the same thing. For households, the message is uglier because households have fewer levers. When strategic shocks compound, households mostly get squeezed through prices, taxes, and weaker services. That is why political honesty matters so much now, and why it is in such short supply. The public is being asked to finance transition, security, moral posture, debt service, and structural slowdown all at once. That package is not sustainable without either real growth or real sacrifice from elites. And elites rarely volunteer. So what is the bottom line for Europe? Europe is not watching the Middle East from a safe balcony. The Gulf War is a stress test for energy, logistics, and the wider dollar architecture. If the US system stabilizes it, the cost of stabilization rises. If it fails to stabilize it, the cost of fragmentation rises. Europe pays in both cases. And the bottom line for the dollar is not finished. But the conditions that made dollar supremacy cheap, universal, and self-reinforcing are weakening. That is how long declines begin, not with disappearance, but with costly maintenance. And the bottom line for politics? A lot of leaders are still speaking in the language of the old order while living on credit from the new one. I'll end with 3 short sentences. The war is regional. The bill is global. The dollar is still dominant. The system around it is less secure. Europe wants strategy. What it has so far is exposure. In the next video, I want to go straight into the European angle. Why another Gulf shock would hit Europe's industry harder than its headlines admit, and why energy independence without affordable molecules is mostly branding. I'd like your view in the comments. If you had to choose what matters more in the next 5 years for Europe, cheaper energy or tighter security, which one do you think governments will actually prioritize in practice? Have a good day and good luck.